begins with A. B. Bear begins with B. C. Cat begins with C. D. Dog begins with D. E. Elephant begins with E.
Next page.
Find the animal whose name begins with A. Good job! Ant begins with A. Find the animal whose name begins with B. Awesome! Bear begins with B. Find the animal whose name begins with C. Yes! Cat begins with C. Find the animal whose name begins with D. That's right! Dog begins with D. Find the animal whose name begins with E. All right! Elephant begins with E. F. Frogs begin with F. G. Giraffe begins with G. H. Hippo begins with H. I. Iguana begins with I. J. Jaguar begins with J.
Next page.
Find the animal whose name begins with F. Good job! Frogs begin with F. Find the animal whose name begins with G. Awesome! Giraffe begins with G. Find the animal whose name begins with H. Yes, hippo begins with H. Find the animal whose name begins with I. Good job! Iguana begins with I. Find the animal whose name begins with J. Excellent! Jaguar begins with J. K. Kangaroo begins with K. L. Lion begins with L. M. Moose begins with M. N. Newt begins with N. O. Octopus begins with O. Find the animal whose name begins with K. Awesome! Kangaroo begins with K. Find the animal whose name begins with L. Good job! Lion begins with L. Find the animal whose name begins with M. That's right! Moose begins with M. Find the animal whose name begins with N. Great job! Newt begins with N. Find the animal whose name begins with O. Fabulous! Octopus begins with O. P. Pig begins with P. Q. Quail begins with Q. R. Rabbit begins with R. S. Snail begins with S. T. Turtle begins with T.
Next page.
Find the animal whose name begins with P. Awesome! Pig begins with P. Find the animal whose name begins with Q. Awesome! Quail begins with Q. Find the animal whose name begins with R. That's right! Rabbit begins with R. Find the animal whose name begins with S. Super! Snail begins with S. Find the animal whose name begins with T. Terrific! Turtle begins with T. U. Unicorn begins with U. V. Vulture begins with V. W. Walrus begins with W. X. X-ray fish begins with X. Y. Yak begins with Y. Z. Zebra begins with Z.
Next page.
Find the animal whose name begins with U. Awesome! Unicorn begins with U. Find the animal whose name begins with V. That's right! Vulture begins with V. Find the animal whose name begins with W. Way to go! Walrus begins with W. Find the animal whose name begins with X. Fantastic! X-ray fish begins with X. Find the animal whose name begins with Y. Yes! Yak begins with Y. Find the animal whose name begins with Z. Super! Zebra begins with Z. K. Kangaroo begins with K. L. Lion begins with L. M. Moose begins with M. N. Newt begins with N.